So, hello everyone, my name is Audrey. I work at the Interact Research Lab, which is a multidisciplinary lab. I work with Yapra Kamara. She has a background in social design, whereas I and Catherine Nelson have a background in engineering and architecture. Thank you for letting me present the first batch of the research I'm conducting for my PhD. And so I'll be talking about considering interactions between architects and clients and looking at them through design thinking framework. I have to inform you that by interaction, I'm actually looking at interaction as social encounter, so as William Little sees it in sociology. So let me set you the scene. I'm taking you to Belgium. I think the rain might help with projecting yourself right there. So on the one hand, a lot of small architectural firms in Belgium are still inspired by an architectural model where the artful persuasion skill of a sole master architect knows exactly what's best for the future occupants of the buildings. And in contrast to these architects, we have the Association for Belgian Consumers, which is called Testacha, publishing about high levels of insatisfaction amongst private clients who are building their personal homes with an architect. And out of that study, so 1,330 participants were surveyed, and amongst them, half mentioned having experienced high stress, and a third of them actually went further, mentioning they experienced anxiety and irritability throughout the process, directed towards their architects. And another study published in 2018 as well expressed this client was among the top 5 factors that made an architect's daily practice more difficult. So on both sides, there are high insatisfaction levels. And then on the other hand, the design field literature seemed to agree that the fact that involving the end user in the design process is essential. And researchers, designers of all fields of design develop great deals of models for design thinking and good practice. And so my focus today lies on Belgian housing designs, architects' posture towards end users, end user involvement, but also to try and draw a parallel between the actual practice of architects in Belgium, from the ones that I interviewed, of course, and design thinking as a mindset and as a process. So in a nutshell, I'll try to make it short because, of course, presenting to you the Belgian context could take hours, but I'll try to make it really short because I know that you're all waiting for lunch right now. So we're in a context where the housing market is absolutely crazy, and even more so than it has ever been. Before, the demand is exploding. The demand for work on actual houses for retrofitting is also really high, and craftsmen are overbooked. And you'll have to know that to build a house or heavily retrofit one in Belgium, as in a lot of places, an architect's intervention is mandatory. And as mentioned before, we observed high rates of insatisfaction and stress. And one more element that you should know about the Belgian context is the gap between design educational background and architectural educational background in Belgium. So the programs rarely, if ever, meet or share courses. So now looking at design thinking as a reflective approach for architects, I think that most architects already combine divergent and convergent thinking, and then that we could refer to as design thinking per se, but those concepts are not systematically, or at least not always explicitly, taught in architectural programs, as we were discussing just before. So that was a perfect entry in matter. So we question if design thinking is already adopted in a way, or if it could be used as an inspiration, for instance, for improvement of architectural practices. And so architectural offices functioning as teams rather than each collaborator on their own are closer to design thinkers or to design thinking mindsets in the sense that during collective ideation processes, they get challenged by other designers. But as shown by Adeline Stiles in 2017 in a survey in Belgium, about 42.7% of the interviewed architects she encountered were working in small offices and do not work as a team on projects, but rather alone or at best in pairs. And if the 5 steps that I showed you before in Brenner and Uber-Nichols models are typically implemented for innovation through design thinking, it is not clear if those steps might be transposed or interpreted in a small-scale practices for design of housing, or if any of the tools that are presenting in that book, so for instance, stakeholder maps, empathy maps, personas, observation, storytelling that we were discussing earlier. We don't know if those are taken upon architects in the Belgian context of housing design. And according to Jacob's paper in 2016, designers should be able to reflect on how they go about the design process itself, taking notes and collecting artifacts in order to be able not only to reflect in action, but also to reflect a posteriori to improve their practice. But we'll see later how that is an actual problem in the daily practice of architects. So for the research methodology for these studies, we broadcast an online survey, but it was mainly to recruit and profile the participants. And out of the 96 respondents, we selected 5. Well, actually now I selected 15 because I was able to conduct more interviews since then. So we selected architects mainly working in residential architecture, because that's our focus right now, and small architecture firms, which represent the majority of architectural practice in Wallonia, at least. And we interviewed them during in-depth interviews, about an hour or two. After transcripting those interviews, we looked for common and singular patterns and compared the discussed practices to the design thinking framework that I was explaining just before, and that I delineate and framed. So what we find, all kinds of nuts. So trust me, I've been both, well, my personal experience actually, it's being both as a client of an architect, so at the end user side of the coin, but also on the other side of the coin as an architect later on. And things can get really crazy, really messy. But all jokes aside, I deeply am grateful for all the interviews and having these volunteers answering my questions and talking to me for 2 hours. So the names that I gave them here are pseudonyms. They're to preserve their anonymity. And what I found is, like, as common ground, in all interviews, apart from the usual tight budget to hold, is the time constraint as being the major issues for architects, keeping them, for instance, from making more metacognitive thinking as recommended in Jacob's work. So, for instance, can Charlie and Richard raise the matter also of architectural educational background compared to the actual practice they're encountering right now? So they weren't prepared by school and by their training for the social skills needed in the architectural world, for the empathy that is required, and for the client support. All three mentioned the need for a psychology training in the architectural training, which they didn't get in theirs. All five architects seem to generally be in favor of user-centered design and human-centered designs, but when depicting their practice and their relationship with their users, it didn't show that much. And Richard, for instance, explicitly says that he knows better what's good for them, not recognizing any client expertise in terms even of the use of the space. Then Ken highlights that he strives on recognition, and he gets that from designing on himself. Leo brings in nuance. So he explains that in real-life setting, he doesn't get the time to actually implement user-centered practice. And architects have little time left to actually design, so that echoes some stuff that we discussed yesterday on the fact that the practice, the design in the practice is actually a really small part of it. Whilst in the training, they thought that was going to be their job. Well, in real life, that's not the case because of actual real-life constraint, time, and being constrained by norms, regulation, and responsibilities. So he also mentions the complexity of communicating with people who do not have an architectural background. This gives me the opportunity to bring up an element I'm putting forward in a systematic literature review that is yet to be published, where one of the results is that the educational and accompaniment role of the architect is expected by end users, and architects could be able to fulfill that, but they're not trained to. However, with the constraint that we were talking earlier about, time, budget, once again, it's freezing that part of the improvement of the profession that's ahead. So there were also a lot of individual stories. I'm not going to go into the details of each of them. I'll just try to pinpoint a couple of good practices that could, in some way, be related to design practices, such as storytelling presentation that Richard did in an anecdote. So he mentioned that presenting a project to a specific client, he thought that it would be a good way of just letting the layouts and the blueprints and the sketches on the side and just narrating a journey through the house. So he mentioned that was a great success, but it was like a one-time thing and that he never did that again, but that it was a success. There's another success story presented by Leo, where he said that in order to prototype kind of how he wanted to partition an entry hall for his clients, he just moved a wardrobe in order to show him how the place could be if they just created a small entry hall. And actually, that answered so well to the client's requirement that he didn't get a job at all. They just kept the wardrobe the way it was. And he thought it was a success story, even though he didn't make any money on it. So that was kind of an anecdote I wanted to pinpoint. So going back to the 5 steps of the design thinking framework, some of the practice that were depicted for need finding were actually close to designer ways. But in the ideation phase, for the recognition part, I think it's a debate that can be also in the design other fields. But architects wanted to keep that to themselves and not sharing in co-design, for instance. Prototyping, they tried some practices did mention some kind of prototyping, as I said, or mood boards, collage, scale models, which are slowly fading because they don't have the budget and the time. VR is trying to push their way in, but in small scales, like practices, housing, they don't have the budget and the time again. And then the testing and refining the problem, like this iteration does occur, but with limited user inputs. It's more of consultation and not actual user inputs. We also saw that there were issues with the feedback. So the feedback was very limited, like after the project, except like staying in touch informally with the clients. But it was really limited. And so we advocate in favor of implementing a deeper loop of user inputs and having them participate to create a momentum of user engagement. So it was a really limited sample, of course, only 5 interviews for this paper, so please be indulgent on that with me. And of course it was interviews, so architects were presenting their practice as they wanted the practice to be seen. And so what we're doing right now with Interact, well, we're trying to invite architect and end user around the table and try to build in from design-based tools, implement them and try to modify them in order for them to fit actual constraints of real-life practices. So if you want more information about that, I invite you to go to our website of Interact, where you will find a bit more on the co-design side of things and the next 10 interviews and how these turned out. And that's it. Thank you very much.